Hi, my name's Stewart Lynch, and in this video I'm going to introduce you to the new gauge view that is now available for all Apple platforms in iOS 16. We'll be exploring the different options for linear gauges as well as circular gauges, and we'll complete the video by creating a fun view with a countdown timer to launch a rocket. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. A gauge view is very much like a progress indicator, but with several new looks and options. The gauge view is available for iOS, macOS, and watchOS. A gauge view shows a current level of a value in relation to a specific finite capacity, very much like a fuel gauge in an automobile. Gauge displays are configurable, and they can show any combination of the gauge's current value, the range the gauge can display, and a label describing the purpose of the gauge itself. In its most basic form, a gauge displays a single value along a path of the gauge mapped into a range from 0 to 1. Now there are two different styles that we can use, and I'm going to cover all of the ones that we can use in iOS in this video. There is a starter project, and I encourage you to work along with me. And yes, in this video you'll notice that I've spelled the gauge incorrectly. I have, however, corrected the starter resources and the completed project that are available for download. And you can download them from the links in the description. Once completed, you'll have samples of all the different types and should have a good understanding afterwards of how to implement and take advantage of gauges in your own projects when you're ready. It's a very simple starter project with a Start tab that contains 3 views. One for each of the 2 different categories of gauges, the linear and the circular, and a third view where we're going to use a timer to implement a rocket launch and display the countdown in a circular gauge view. I've also added a couple of extra assets besides the app icon and the image that I use for the launch screen. One is this rocket that I'll use in the final view, and the other is this small star image. I encourage you to check out the developer documentation for Gauge. It's a great overview along with some sample code, but the focus is on watchOS, and we're using iOS in this video. So let's get started. The text that I've placed below each section header here in the form for each view is copied directly from the documentation, and I like to have it here because it reminds me of what this particular gauge can do. As I mentioned in the beginning, the gauge displays a single value along a path of the gauge in a range from 0 to 1. I'm going to be changing that range shortly to allow us to control that particular value. But first, let's just create a gauge and choose its simplest form, and we'll set the value to 0.2. And for the label, I can just enter a text view using the string rating. We can also add a tint to the gauge view to change the color of the bar. This is the basic linear view. So within this section, let's create another one of these, but I want to bind that value to a state property that I can manipulate via a slider. So I'm going to create a new private state property, and it has to be a floating point decimal or double. So let's call it value and assign it the value 20 by adding .0 to force that double value. I'll also want to have a minimum and maximum value as well that I can use for my slider as well as my gauge. So let's create 2 more properties, and they don't have to be state properties because we're not going to be changing them in code, and call the first one minimum and assign it 0.0, and then the second we'll call it maximum and assign it 100.0. So below that first gauge in the same section, I'm going to create a new gauge and set the value to our state property. And then I'll choose the value label overload again, but hold the Option key down on the keyboard to get the in argument as well. And now when I hit return, I now have those 2 arguments. So we'll bind it to our value, and then the range will be from our minimum to our maximum. It looks just like the first one, except for the tint color. But we'll come back to that. Below the spacer in our view, let's add a slider. And I want to bind that slider to that same value, state property, and set the range to between minimum and maximum here too. Let me add some padding as well. Now as I slide the slider, I see the gauge move from 0 through to 100. If I option click on gauge, we get to see the quick help. And I can also see from the sample code here that there are 3 other arguments that I can use: current value label, minimum value label, and maximum value label. And all 3 are closures that produce views, so let's add these now. For the current value label, we'll create a text view and use string interpolation to present the integer representation of our double value. And then we can similarly present the integer representations for the minimum and maximum values as well for our minimum and maximum value labels. This provides me much more information now. For our first example, we saw that tint took on a color value. If we look at our overload here, we can see that there's one more option beside color. So if we tap the right arrow key on our keyboard, it expands, and we see that we can use anything that conforms to the shape style protocol. Now remember that star asset I had? Well, let's use that in an image paint shape style and use that star image for the argument. Now our gauge displays rating stars. I also mentioned that the gauge has a number of different styles, and each of the different device types has a different default. In iOS, the default gauge style is LinearCapacity. So when I add that here, I see that nothing changes. The gauge style of LinearCapacity is the default gauge style for iOS. Well, in the next section, I want to take a look at a different gauge style. So why don't we just copy that same one from above that we used in the last one and change some things. So I'm going to copy everything except the tint and gauge style and paste it in here. Those are the 2 things I want to change. I also want to change my label to be temperature instead of rating. But we'll still use the same value and minimum and maximum value properties. For the tint this time, I'm going to use a different shape style. I'm going to use a gradient. And for the gradient, I'll set the points to 5 different colors in the gradient colors array. We'll use blue, green, yellow, orange, and then red. As I slide the slider now, the gauge gets hotter or colder depending on the way I move. But let's change the gauge style now to AccessoryLinear. When we do that, the entire gauge view is displayed, but a circle dot is placed where our value is located. If we comment out the minimum value labels and the maximum value label views, the current value then gets displayed at the leading edge. In both cases, however, the text label for our gauge itself of temperature is not displayed. So, if we like, we can remove it. But let me uncomment the minimum and maximum labels now. In the final section, I want to check out one more style. So let's copy that gauge view from above again. But this time I'm going to copy the tint, but not the style. We're back to that LinearCapacity default again. Now let's add a style of AccessoryLinearCapacity. A couple of things have happened. the current value is displayed below, but the gradient tint is not applied. So it looks like the gradient shape style doesn't work with this AccessoryLinearCapacity shape style. Let's change it just to be a color, like red. That seems to work. And remember, we removed the gauge label from that previous gauge. So let's see if it works here. So I'm just going to add a temperature text view in here using that string temperature. Well, now we see it directly above the gauge at the leading edge. Keep in mind that this is any view, so we could get even more fancy here with all of our views that are currently just displaying text. Let's move on to the circular gauge now. All gauges have a default range of 0 through 1 unless otherwise specified. So let's copy the properties from our previous view as well as the slider for this view. Let's change the value to be 0.0 and set a minimum to negative 10.0 and the maximum to positive 10.0. And I'm using .0 here again, otherwise Swift will assume that these are integers, so we need them to be doubles. Let's create the default gauge now and hold down that option key so that we get the in-range argument as well. And value is our value property, and the range as before will go from the minimum to the maximum. And again, I'm going to use the text view with the string rating for the label. Now we need to change the style because it's that default linear gauge, so I'm going to choose a circular style of AccessoryCircular. Now this is pretty small and the label itself is a bit large. Well, we can increase the size of the gauge by setting a scale effect. So let's choose 1.5 and then add some padding. You can see that ratings label is really too big, and setting a font size isn't going to help us here. What we can do is set another scale effect on this text view to reduce the size of that label. So let's set it to be a scale effect this time of 0.75. Well, this still doesn't really tell me much because I'm not seeing my current value. So let's add that current value closure and use a text view. We're using string interpolation again to present the integer representation of that value. That's better. Let's also add a tint color. How about teal? Now the contrast between the labels and the gauge is a bit much, so let's fix that by simply adding a foreground color to our text views. So how about purple? That's looking pretty good. However, I'm not seeing the minimum and maximum value labels in this example. I'd have to go to the extremes of my slider to see them. So let me just copy this and duplicate this gauge and add it to a second example within this section. But this time I'm going to add the two minimum value labels and maximum value label closures. And then within here I can do the same string interpolation to display the integer representation of our minimum and maximum values. What happens when I do that, however, is that when I use these two labels, I lose the ratings label. So beware of that. So we can remove it here if we want because it's not being used. The circular gauge has one other type that we can use, and it's the AccessoryCircularCapacity style. So let me just copy that last gauge entirely, paste it into the next section. I'll also want to add back that gauge label that I had in the first one. Now I can change the style to AccessoryCircularCapacity. And also, why don't we change all of the colors, both the tint color and the foreground colors, all to red this time. This new gauge is a complete circle that uses an opacity to demonstrate the position of the value within the range. Here we see we are halfway, as both the full and the opacity values are equal. As I move the slider to the max, the entire circle is complete with the full color. As I move to the minimum, it's all faded. Notice that even though I added that gauge label, it's not being displayed here either, nor are the minimum and maximum values. So we can remove those from our views completely, as they're ignored in this gauge. In this final view, I want to launch the rocket and take it from the bottom leading edge to the top trailing edge. And I've created an enum called rocket placement that provides me with two static properties that are tuples that give me the start coordinates and the end coordinates for our device that I can use in my code. This value will get assigned to the offset values for our rocket image as it moves from one to the other location. So the first thing I want to do is to create a gauge that will count down from 10 down to 0. So let's create our three properties. First, a state property called countdown with an initial value of 10.0. And then a minimum property set at 0.0. And we'll follow that with a maximum set at 10.0. Next, above the spacer in our VStack, let's create a gauge using that value within that minimum to maximum range. And then for the label, I want to use a ternary operator on countdown so that we can create a text view that when the countdown is greater than 0, it'll say countdown, but when it reaches 0, it'll say blast off. I will use a current value label here that will be a text view using the integer representation of our countdown value. Let's change the gauge type to one of our circular ones, and I'll use the first one that we looked at, the AccessoryCircular. Then I'm going to increase the size by applying a scale effect of 2.0 on that gauge, but also reduce the scale of the gauge label by setting a scale effect of 0.75. Now I want to use a gradient tint. And for this, I'm going to use a gradient shape style. So we can create that gradient, and within the array are two colors. For the first one, at the minimum side, it will be a color of red with an opacity of 0.4 up to the maximum, which will be a full capacity red color. And then finally, let's add some padding to the top. Now below that gauge, I want the button that will start our countdown to launch. So let's create that button, but first I'll need a Boolean value that we can toggle. So I'm going to create a state property called start and initialize it as false. Then below the gauge, then we'll create that button. And then I'm going to use another ternary operator again. If the countdown is 10, we can specify launch as the string. Otherwise, we'll want it to say reset so that we can stop our launch or after launch, reset it. And then for the action, if the countdown is 10, we can set start to true when we click on the button to start our countdown. Else, we'll set start to false to stop the launch. We'll reset the countdown back to 10. And if we've already blasted off, we'll want to set our rocket offset back to the start position. Let's also set a button style to bordered prominent. So once we start, we want to count down. And to do this, we can use a timer that's always running by creating a timer property that's publishing every 1 second. So let's create that timer. And it's going to be equal to an instance of the timer that publishes every 1 second on the main queue in common. And then I want it to auto-connect when our view is presented, meaning it's going to start publishing as soon as the view gets presented. So if it's publishing this every second, we want to receive and respond. So we can create an onReceive, and that publisher is our timer, and then we can perform an action. Well, we don't need the timer value, so I'll just use an underscore here. Now, if the countdown is greater than 0 and we've started, so start is true, we can decrement our countdown property. And we can also do that within an animation block. Otherwise, else, if the countdown is equal to 0 and we've started, we create another animation block. This time we'll ease in with a duration of 2, and then set our rocket offset to the rocket placement's end property. And then we'll set our start value back to false. And that's it. Let's test. When I tap the launch button, the countdown begins. Now, I can reset it anytime after launch in order to abort the launch. And that sets it back to 10 and start is again false. So let's start it again and see if we can go all the way through. After 10 seconds, our rocket launches. I can reset it again and launch again if I like. So that's the new gauge view for iOS 16. I hope you learned something that you can use in your projects, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to get notified when I post new videos. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch, and I hope to see you in the next video.